Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening to this. I'm your host, Leafy Potato, and welcome to another episode of the Joy of NRTS podcast. This week's episode, I understand, is a bit delayed. I do apologize for that delay, but honestly, I owe you nothing. I still appreciate your viewership, though. In any case, I have my pink Moscato ready to sip as I discuss very important elements of NRTS late game. So, I understand at some point I'm going to have to do a video about how to not die until late game, though I'm pretty sure I have a couple rants on the Discord. If you want to go to game discussion and just scroll for a little bit, you can just search how to not die. I might actually already have a video on that. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I'm too lazy to check. In any case, gotta love Moscato. I know none of you guys are old enough to drink, but write it down. Moscato. Alright, where do I begin? I believe before starting a discussion on late game, I should probably go ahead and define what I think late game is in an RTS, because I know that people's definitions vary wildly. To me, late game is a state where you are working on and utilizing your ideal army compositions, where there is no real compromise being made actively in terms of the units that you are making. So there's a couple compromises that you could be making in terms of unit production. One of them is simply not making tier 2 units because you don't have tier 2 units unlocked yet. You haven't paid for the research and you haven't waited the time. That's the most obvious one. The next one, when your housing isn't done, every $45 that you spend on units is $45 you're not spending on housing, which means 10 eco that you don't get. So when you aren't already maxed on housing, there's another element of sacrifice that you're making whenever you're having to build units. So the two most important things for me, as that defines late game to me, are you have access to upgraded units and you have all of your housing built. Of course, late game's going to look pretty different depending on the map, depending on the game mode, but those are the most identifiable features, and I think that you'll find today's episode to be relevant to any situation in an RTS where you find yourself under these circumstances or against an opponent with these circumstances. So, very often in NRTS 1v1, you'll start seeing late game start to crop up about 15 minutes into the game on average. Sometimes it's before then, usually not at any sort of large enough scale to matter. I think scale is relevant when discussing late game because at a smaller scale, some things are more relevant than others. But generally, 15 minutes is when you start to feel late game. Let me take another sip of my wine real quick. Okay. I've already, in the previous episode, discussed my ideas on unit relevance to late game and what I think the most important units are. And I'll briefly discuss them again. We have the heavy tank. It does splash damage. That's the biggest thing. It does a lot of damage and it does splash damage. So it is the bread and butter of you putting the hurt on a ground army. You have artillery, which allows you to strike at static defenses at range. Otherwise, static defenses can be quite a problem for you. You have workers, which are what you need in order to build static defenses so that you can punish an underappreciation of artillery. You have choppers, because it allows you to shoot at heavy tanks, artillery, and workers for free. And then you have medics, because medics are a way for you to provide more than 3 hospitals of healing to your army, and also healing that moves, so you can spend population for healing. Very important. So those 5 units are generally always going to be seen at some point during an NRTS late game. Of course, other relevant units are discussed in the last week's episode, so you can go and check that out if you really are interested. I think, though, that having that idea of those 5 units and what their strengths and weaknesses are would be helpful in this discussion. Okay, so in carrying out your late game, I want to address strategies that you should have in mind and tricks that you need to look out for and maybe consider abusing when you are in late game attempting to gain an advantage over an opponent that is equally trying to win. Most of my experience in this regard is going to come from my 1v1 games. I have played quite a bit in PLs as well, but generally speaking, the 1v1 matches are against higher caliber opponents, and so I feel that I learn more from those games than I do in PLs, though I have had some very, very intense public games. Okay, so, first off, I think it's important to realize how important... I'm going to highlight artillery first, because I think no matter what units you're using, you need artillery in some capacity. I want to stress how important artillery is to your ability to fight in a late game. Not having artillery allows the opponent to constantly, slowly maybe, but constantly move forward with workers building towers. In order to stop them making towers and missile turrets, which are another big problem that you need artillery to deal with, you would have to charge into them with units if you had no artillery. Artillery having the same range as a tower means that you can guaranteed fight one tower at a time, and you can have enough healing to be able to undo all of the damage that you are taking as you are striking at enemy towers. With other units, there is no way to guarantee a certain amount of damage is being taken at any particular time. If your opponent decides that they want to cluster a lot of towers together and form a massive force field, you will be shot at by all of those towers if you try to take out one or two of them. Which, granted, the heavy tanks have splash damage, so you can punish that a little bit, but so does artillery, and artillery does a better job at punishing that because you don't have to take so much fire in order to stop the towers. You can still force static defenses if you really wanted to, but the opponent can basically, for next to free in late game terms, cause you a lot of pain with very little investment. Workers and towers compared to everything else in late game are just that cheap. So artillery, very, very important. Artillery as well as medics, so you can't just make a single artillery and say, I'm good to go, though a single artillery will prevent your opponent from moving forward with towers, as you can put your artillery on the edge of the range of their tower, and so if they move forward at all, the new building gets shelled for free before it can fire back. So there's that. Worth considering making the artillery before you make medics, but only in very specific circumstances, and generally speaking, you're going to want the medics to heal up your army anyways, so medics should come before artillery. Most games. Okay, next. I do want to stress how respectful you should be of the enemy's air force. It does not take a whole lot of choppers to start putting real hurt on your tanks if they are exposed. There are a couple of ways that you can deal with choppers in late game. The most straightforward is with anti-air. It makes sense. You anti the air around your ground army, and then suddenly your ground army can perform their duties as necessary. Very, very easy. Very simple. Very exploitable as well. Anti-air taking population means that they're going to be part of your army. Generally speaking, you're very rarely going to see your anti-air break off from the army formation, and that means that, generally speaking, your anti-air is going to be stuck in whatever place your army is, right? You need them to defend yourself on the move, but when that's the case, you don't have them defending your command center, you don't have them defending your farms. It's just a whole mess. Static defenses are also going to be relevant, and while making static defenses to defend your farms and your houses, well, houses maybe more so, but defending your farms in the early and mid game with towers and missile turrets is a bit ridiculous. Doing so in the late game is a worthwhile investment. Spending that $49 for a missile turret, if it's in a location that can cover one, even, like, if you get lucky, covering two farms is great too. But just having those missile turrets around to punish choppers from flying into your territory means that your opponent has less options to deal damage to you. And so, very quickly, especially if you're relying on upgraded farms to bolster your economy, a $35 upgraded farm getting taken out twice is $70 that you don't have, and then you still don't have a farm. So you need to spend another $35 to get it back. Once you start doing that sort of math and you're understanding how vulnerable your position might be, missile turrets can be a decent investment. And of course, putting them around your command center basically guarantees the opponent either needs to nuke you or have artillery up on your base. So missile turrets are going to be very useful. But without choppers in the mix, there's no real pressure for the opponent to be building so much static defense, right? Vehicle depot armies are generally pretty slow, and they're pretty heavy-hitting. Tanks oppose tanks pretty well, and they sort of get into a deadlock. If you play chess at all, it's almost like the deadlock that pawns get into with each other, where you just lock a pawn in front of another pawn and they never move ever again. A well-microed late-game army very often will get into a stalemate wherever the fight initially starts. Some of that's down to static defense being so hard to remove, but a lot of that is just down to your ground armies being able to take disproportionately good fights when you have a smaller army, thanks to heavy tank splash. Now, So yeah, choppers put pressure on your opponent to spend money on static defense that would otherwise be irrelevant. Now the static defense ends up being quite good because choppers are very frequently made, and also the static defense can help you have a hedge in the event that you start losing ground in the main fight, like wherever you're taking your fight. You can actually retreat and have some place to build static defenses from again, and not just be out in the middle of nowhere. So there's also that element, but choppers mostly force your opponent to invest into those sorts of defenses at a time when they might be needing to produce more units, especially if they're not maxed yet. They would much rather be making tanks than trying to get static defense to deal with your air force. And in all of this, as I'm going forward, and I suppose I should have prefaced this earlier, I'm trying to explain to you the significance of the different units in the late game and what their greatest strength really is. Artillery allows you to, in any meaningful way, deal with static defense repeatedly, and that's very good. If artillery is left to its own devices, it will just chew through static defense all the way to a command center if it's allowed to. Of course, there's going to be other units in the way, and so dealing with those units becomes a tricky problem. But artillery is the thing that allows you to win games ultimately. Choppers, very good at harassment, put an immense amount of pressure on the opponent's farms, and the farms are what ends up making a late game economy relevant or like better. In the early game, farms are extremely important. In the mid game, farms, take them or leave them. They are important, but you can't just keep exponentially expanding your economy with farms. You need to also consider building houses, and houses can't be easily destroyed. In the late game, when everyone's got maxed housing, the only thing that can really differentiate economy is farms. And so, farms gain relevance in the late game, and Chopper's ability to contest farm space becomes very, very relevant. Now, workers in late game, extraordinarily powerful because towers are so oppressive and metagame shaping. Without artillery, towers would be kind of busted. Thankfully, there is artillery, but towers are the reason why the opponent would make any artillery in the first place. Otherwise, what's the point? There is a point, and I'll get to that in a bit, but so workers allow you to build things, including static defenses. They allow you to take new farms as you go forward, so having some workers with your army, if your army is pushing through the opponent's territory, allows you to exploit gains that you make in a rapid fashion. Also, having some workers around your farms as you're building static defenses on them in a very late game, having workers around your territory can allow you to rebuild farms after an opponent hits them. So if they were to send in a raid and successfully destroy a couple of your farms, you can go and rebuild whenever the raid leaves. Or you can start creeping more heavily with static defenses towards the farms that you just lost in order to retake them and keep them for the long run. A healthy supply of workers really can make the difference between a victory and a loss in a really contested late game, as you're more able to build things more quickly and at scale. Right, an opponent who builds a tower with one worker in the front lines is not going to be doing so well in a tower war or an artillery push against an opponent who's got, say, 5-6 workers at the front, able to either all build a tower at once to get it up quickly, to exploit little gaps whenever your artillery does manage to strike down an enemy tower, or able to make multiple towers at once across an entire front to quickly establish a new front, versus an opponent who can't do that in any sort of reasonable time because they've only got a worker at the front, right? So having more workers than your opponent can be a very valuable asset, though their value is very much tied to your ability to use your artillery continuously, which can be difficult given how much pressure artillery are under from enemy heavy tanks, from enemy choppers, even just from the static defense that they're required to fight. They need medic support in order to do anything, and if those medics are healing artillery, they're not healing other units, which means that you might start having to pull your artillery back in order to heal up your main tank formation or your choppers or whatever. So workers get better and better the better you are at keeping your artillery shooting at the enemy towers, but I can understand some players struggling to generate the value that they really do seek from said workers. Of course, the next unit that I should talk about is the heavy tank. I already mentioned earlier, high damage, extremely good damage, and also AoE, right? It's not just that it's high damage, but it's the AoE that really sells them. A single heavy tank shot, placed well, can hit 3-4 enemy tanks if it manages to hit a ball of medics or anti-air, you can talk about more than 10 units being affected, each of which taking 25 damage. Right, a single heavy tank shot hitting the enemy's medics can basically disable them for almost a minute. It's crazy. So heavy tanks are extremely strong, and most of your ground pushes are going to revolve around heavy tanks in some meaningful way. Heavy tanks are your best way to punish an enemy's underproduction of army units, as you can use them to shove enemy artillery. You can use them to punish underproduction of heavy tanks, over reliance on anti-air, if they're making anti-air, too many workers in one particular spot, any number of things. Heavy tanks are great at punishing an opponent who is too carefree. Of course, if you make too many heavy tanks and you don't have enough air cover, then suddenly a ball of choppers can be a massive problem for you. But that's usually not the case in a well-scaled late game. The problems that you're going to encounter with heavy tanks sucking against choppers are really going to come from not having full production up and not having a full army on the field yet. If you can manage to get yourself to close to max population, that's almost not a concern whatsoever. Now, while you're trying to get to max population, your best bet against enemy chopper production is probably your own, just so that you can hit them with one chopper for every chopper they got. If you decide that you want to go chopper anti-air, that's not bad either, just to understand that you're going to have to play around your anti-air, which makes sense. It's an asset you choose to build, but it can slow down your choppers a little bit in exchange for giving them a zone where the enemy really can't fight you. So in getting to ramped up production in late game, you might already have 2-3 tanks and artillery and some medics, but relying on choppers can be a good tactic to get yourself to the position where you can actually engage in a ground fight against an opponent with a massive ball of choppers. Continuing forward, medics, of course. Production of medics is pretty much the default way that people choose to spend their population in late game if they're not choosing to spend it default on choppers. Every 5 medics can heal about the same as a hospital, so if you want to consider it as every 10 population being one hospital, you can. I think that's actually a decent way to think about it. You have 110 population in total. How much population do you want to sacrifice in order to heal, right? You already have your 3 hospitals you can make with power, and one strength of having multiple workers in the first place is being able to sell and rebuy hospitals as your frontline moves, right? Being able to move that healing with you, because you, by all means, should have all 3 of your hospitals down in a late game, and you probably should be moving it with the front as well. It's not that expensive to sell and rebuy a hospital compared to buying a new one, so just consider it. But I have seen a lot of success from people who even aren't doing that, which they should, but a lot of success from people just making something like 20 medics, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, it's 40 population, but making 20 medics and just walking them with the army, because then you have 1600 HP a minute that you're able to generate, and so you're able to heal off heavy tank shots in some sort of reasonable fashion. I would not be making more than 40 population in medics, mainly due to the fact that you will now no longer have the strength you need to fight against the enemy, right? At a certain point, you can sort of make up for a lack of tanks with splash damage, provided you have, I like to say 6 to 8 tanks is sort of that number that you need minimum before you can start fighting pretty much any number of tanks. 6 to 8 tanks just allows you to have enough damage going forward and covering enough ground while you're spreading them in order to hit basically every one of the enemy's tanks whenever they fight you. And so Splash can kind of carry you through that day. But if you're making too many medics, then suddenly having that bare minimum amount of tanks leaves you either without air cover, without sufficient artillery, without worker support, or without decent anti-air as you're going forward. So it's something that you should be aware of. Also, the diminishing returns of spending even more population on healing can be very apparent. Though, if you are playing in a 3v3, it isn't even a terrible idea to have somebody be like a designated medic support player. Though, if that somebody is going to be designated medic support, everyone else should still have their medic core with them. It's just easier to have medics you can control with your army. And if you are going to be designated medic support player, please, for the love of God, put your medics in a transport copter. I don't need my army tripping over your medics in a firefight. In any case, with that out of the way, we should go on to tricks and tactics. So, very relevant to late game. If you've played any amount of late game NRTS in the past year, you have certainly encountered generator spam, or gen shielding, or whatever you want to call it, which is more effective when it's not spam, but a couple generators being used to punish poor micro and poor strategic decision making. In short, what gen shielding attempts to do, if you are unfamiliar with this somehow, is exploit the fact that your units in NRTS will shoot at the closest thing to them by placing something in front of your army and between your army and your opponent's army for your opponent to shoot at with their heavy tanks to negate all of their heavy tank splash. While you shoot freely at their army, they're shooting at a single generator. And so your tanks manage to hit their tanks for massive damage, and they are shooting at a $30 building that you pulled out of thin air. Of course, there is some counterplay to the generator spam strategy. The best one is just patience, honestly. You pull back as soon as you think the opponent's about to whip out a generator, and you just let them have wasted that $30. That $30 isn't that much money in the context of a late game, but it is still relevant. It's about a fifth of a tank. Right, you could say a sixth of a tank, which it's closer to, a sixth of a tank. So if they play 6 generators and they get no value out of them, they've wasted a tank. For basically free for you as the defender to someone trying to use generator shielding. Now, another thing, if the opponent's trying to push forward and places a generator in front of their army, the natural next position for their army is to be on top of said generator, right? They're moving toward you, they're placing a generator between you and them, and they're still moving toward you, meaning the generator will now be on their army. What that means is suddenly you have a target for your artillery, and your artillery can start hitting their units. Though it's not targeting their units, it's targeting the generator that just so happens to be right below their ball of heavy tanks and medics, right? So you can have a decent chance of counterplay with a solid artillery core. I would recommend in the late game having 2, maybe 3 artillery. Not just because having 2 or 3 artillery means that you can break towers that much faster and have artillery in multiple positions, but that you can start killing generators more quickly and also have multiple shots volleying towards enemy generators if the opponent's army decides to step on the generator. Right? Of course, artillery having more range than the opponent's units means that if they're at the back line of your formation, they can still be shooting at the enemy's generator when your tanks are in no position to do so, and so you can just get free unopposed damage, and their artillery can't strike back at you because you have no buildings in range of them. They just have a building in range of you because they decided to drop one out of nowhere. Anyways, generator shielding is extraordinarily dangerous. You should be very wary of it, and honestly, it's a bit too cheap for what it can do to your army, right? A well-placed generator or 2 can basically negate any and all damage of your army. And so when you are playing in a late game scenario where you have big armies of tanks against someone, you should be aware, A, that if you're fighting outside of range of your own tower support, enemy formations are going to be able to just fight you straight up. They don't even need artillery, they can just fight you, right? You want to be fighting in range of friendly static defenses so that you can be dealing good damage to the opponent. And of course, they're going to be wanting to fight in range of their friendly static defenses for the same reason. What that also does to you is it provides you a retreat path to punish the opponent for chasing you, which will happen if you're fighting out in the open. If you fight out in the open and the opponent is like on top of you, so long as both of you and your opponent are moving at the same speed with your armies, which you will because they're going to be made of the same units, right? If you and your opponent are moving at the same speed, they can guaranteed chase you down and destroy all of your units. If you ever shoot at the opponent, they can always guarantee that they keep shooting at you until their units are gone, or until your units are gone. So what static defenses allow you to do is have a sort of cutoff point where, okay, the opponent doesn't want to chase me anymore because now they're getting shot at by a couple towers and some missile turrets, right? So we're gonna give myself an out in the event that I, for whatever reason, screw up my micro. So fighting should take place in close proximity to friendly static defenses, and preferably a decent amount of them, 4 or 5 towers at a front at minimum. and then some supporting missile turrets maybe a little bit further in the backline to prevent the opponent from trying to shove through your static defenses. Because if they can get tanks just on top of towers, they can start dealing very good damage to the towers very quickly. So having some missile turrets around can punish an opponent trying to go too fast. Okay. But yes, so against an opponent with a big late game army, you can attempt to use generator shielding to your benefit if you really wish, though it's very difficult to get consistent results with it if both you and your opponent are going for it. The most consistent result that you can get as a defender to somebody trying to gen shield you is to just pull back and let your artillery deal with the generators. At best, you get free damage on their army and you kill a generator. At worst, you get a generator. That's provided that you never get into actual fighting range of the opponent anyways. Some keen opponents will wait for a firefight to start, wait for your units to start shooting at theirs, and then they'll go for the generator placement. Usually, though, it leads to one of two results. Either A, the opponent is not moving their army at the time that they're going to grab their generator, and so it gives you an opportunity when you see the opponent's army isn't moving to immediately back off. So you poke forward, you wait for like half a second, and you back off immediately, preemptively, expecting that generator to be placed, and if it is placed, you get a free generator. And then the opponent's army might try to chase you afterwards, and there's nothing that they can do about it because you're already out of range, because you preemptively moved back. Now, there's also the enemy that will first move their army forward to engage your units, and like just basically click towards your formation, and then they'll place the generator, in which case they're almost guaranteed not going to be able to stop their units from like running over the generator, again, meaning that your artillery can get into the fight. So even if your tanks start shooting at a generator and the generator starts taking some damage for basically free, your artillery will at least be lobbing some shells that way as well, which will drop a couple seconds later, which might hit the enemy's formation, which can deal serious damage to them. So in either case, pulling back away from the opponent's army is the best course of action, and creeping forward with your towers to take land is also the best course of action. Your army really should only exist for the purposes of being able to shove the enemy's artillery back and cripple their ability to keep their artillery on your towers in an ideal late game, right? Towers and artillery are going to matter more than anything else, and every other unit will be there to support your artillery. Should you lack in artillery, and should you lack in workers, your game will start falling apart rapidly, right? If the opponent has tower support and is pushing forward with tower support and is claiming all of your territory because you have no static defenses, you don't have much of an option except to keep retreating, in which case the opponent keeps advancing, and then you have less place to retreat to, and you eventually run out of space, and the opponent's army is already on your command center, and that's terrible. You don't want that. So, in any case, using static defense in a late game is very important, period. Not only does it provide you with somewhere to retreat to in the event that you're a victim of generator shielding, right? It limits the amount of time that your opponent can exploit a successful generator. But also, you can use it as an offensive tool to claim and hold ground and force your opponent to then fight you in an artillery duel instead of fighting you in an open battle. So artillery duels, much slower paced, much more straightforward, I would say. They can get sort of messy, but not nearly as messy as open combat with heavy tanks. I would generally advise against open combat with heavy tanks if you can afford it, and if you have any power to be spending whatsoever, you really should be using it to creep forward onto the opponent. If you run out of power in the pursuit of tower creeping somebody, you can start selling the towers and such closer to home or closer to where the push started, as they're no longer going to be as relevant to the push at hand, and then keep your workers building forward. Right, of course, selling your hospitals and rebuying them close to the front lines wherever possible so that you can get basically a stimulus of 15 medics of healing whenever you need it. Okay, but yes. Another thing, if I haven't already mentioned it, and forgive me if I'm going back over things, towers as well can prevent generators from being as damaging to your units. I believe towers shoot just a little bit faster than your units do in the first place. Not by much, but by enough that it can matter, that if you have enough towers covering an area, and an enemy places a generator within it, your units will not be able to shoot at the generator, but because by the time they think about it the gen's already dead. It's been shot to pieces by towers. And so generator shielding becomes less viable when you're doing it into enemy static defenses, especially heavy enemy static defenses. Okay, so I've discussed a little bit my idea that the late game really should be defined by artillery and by towers. By extension, it's also going to be defined by medics, because medics let you heal off damage that you're going to be incurring as you're constantly fighting enemy towers. So, reliance on artillery, reliance on medics, reliance on workers. If you have nothing else, artillery, medics, and workers can punish an enemy who doesn't have anything but static defense. Of course, it's not going to be able to fight armies very well, but you can at least make it extremely costly to push you back with anything short of artillery and medics from the opponent. Okay, so I've yammered on quite a bit about late game, about a couple tricks, mainly the generator spamming. I would be wary if you are using choppers in the late game, and you see that your opponent has a composition that involves both choppers and anti-air escorting enemy tanks. Do not use your choppers as offensive tools at that point. Honestly, at some point, it might be more worthwhile for you to just go ahead and upgrade an air pad, make a couple fighters, and seek some value with your choppers, but if you lose them, start replacing them with other units. Simply because the enemy, should you not have enough anti-air nearby, the enemy can poke at you with their choppers and be a complete nuisance. You, ideally in a late game, want to have a chopper advantage, right? You want to have a chopper advantage. If you have a composition, say, like heavy tank, chopper, artillery, medic, you're going to need to start working with your static defense to provide you with offensive pressure to push the enemy's army back. Your army, while it can deal significant damage to the opponents, is susceptible to failures of coordination. Read, my choppers were on top of their anti-air before my tanks could shoot at them, or my tanks were too far forward in an attempt to shoot the enemy's tanks and anti-air and got wrecked by choppers, right? You can succeed with a push with chopper, medic, tank, though it is quite difficult, and honestly, chopper, medic, tank is better as a very lightweight defensive composition that relies on artillery to get damage done rather than fighting the opponent's army. Chopper, anti-air tank, in my experience, has been more able and readily willing to punish mistakes from an opponent. Now, of course, chopper is going to get shredded by anti-air, so if you're fighting chopper, anti-air tank against, say, tank AA already medic, you're going to have a little bit of trouble getting use out of your choppers, but push comes to shove, you can still keep them around just to force your opponent to protect their farmland, or you can build up enough of them that you can go and hit a couple of missile turret farms, and then just go back and heal, right? Applying pressure, again, to the enemy's farmland. And if, for whatever reason, the opponent ever has their anti-air out of position and they push forward with their tanks, either to protect their anti-air from enemy tank splash, or for whatever reason they've got the anti-air defending something else, you can just chomp on the enemy tanks with your choppers. So, chopper anti-air as a sort of backbone of offensive pressure, supported by heavy tanks to prevent the enemy from just punishing your reliance on anti-air to swing the air fight, can work as a late game composition and should be respected. It's better in an open field. It's worse on the defense. If they're having to defend an artillery push, the anti-air are kind of just splash magnets from enemy artillery. So, for sure, something to keep an eye out. If you're just going to use the 5 units that I suggest as your late game compositions, you really, really want to be making sure that you are relying on static defenses to push the enemy around, and you ideally are fighting on a decently wide front, such that you can encircle the enemy and encircle the enemy with towers, force them when they're trying to fight one of your towers to have to then put out a fire somewhere else when your workers swap sides, or you have a worker on a different flank building a new tower over there. Basically, make the enemy fight you in an artillery duel, and then justify your population spend as more useful than theirs, right? If they're building a lot of anti-air in order to stop your choppers, but you never use your choppers in an offensive action, and you only use them on the defense to prevent enemy choppers from just diving your stuff, then their anti-air never really get to do a thing, and so they have however much population not spent on artillery, medics, tanks, and choppers, or workers. A very key thing about all of this, it does not matter how skilled you are at NRTS beyond a certain point, though of course skill does matter to get you to that point. Beyond a certain point, your skill level doesn't matter at all in NRTS if you don't give yourself the units that you need in order to fight a late game effectively, and if you're adopting a poor strategy to fight a late game. If your idea of late game involves charging militia soldier into static defense over and over again, you're going to be in for a rude awakening when you realize that no matter how much pop you have in just infantry, you are not able to break through a well-fortified set of static defenses, let alone the tanks defending them. If your idea is, I want this game to end quickly, and your opponent already has heavy tanks and is starting to make towers, you have to accept the reality that that's just not happening. And you have to learn how to fight a late game. If, say, you favor a more aggressive playstyle, that is fine, but it will require a different mentality than you would have to have in an earlier mid-game. You can't just accept, like, oh, I'm going to be able to dive my choppers onto the enemy CC at the 10-minute mark and get a free kill. That's just not something you're going to see very often in a Supreme late game, because there's going to be static defenses everywhere, and your choppers are going to get shredded to pieces. You can't force a late game with impatience. Every late game strategy that you can adopt will invariably at some level require patience. Whether that be patience on the attack, right? Waiting for your resources to come to bear, waiting for your workers to start working on static defenses to push back the enemy. Waiting for static defenses to build to push forward at all is very difficult, especially when the enemy's trying to provoke you. They're moving their army around. You've got a decent position in front of their base, and you don't want to lose it. Ground can be lost and retaken. Your army is ridiculously difficult to replace. So if it's between holding your ground or keeping your army, keep your army. I think I should make that point. And a lot of... Some of these points are like coming to mind recently because I played a late game against Kuro where I got my... I'm just going to put it... I got my ass kicked because I lost... Well, there's a number of reasons. I was careless against enemy generator usage and got punished by it multiple times. At some point, I lost all of my heavy tanks when Kuro still had 6 or 7. And at that point, he could just kind of shove his way through unupgraded towers on Desert Conflict as green, hitting orange. And there's not a whole lot of real estate to work with between the two of them. Had I had any amount of units able to respond to his push forward after he decided to shove my static defense, I could have at least put some significant hurt on him and bought myself time to remake some units. Instead, by deciding to throw away an army of heavy tanks due to carelessness and out of a feeling that I might lose my frontal position, I lost all of my position and eventually my command center because I couldn't stop his artillery from shelling me because he had too many tanks defending it. Right, so, I don't know exactly how I got to this point, but for sure, if you have to choose between land and an army can fight the opponent at your command center if you really have to. Land isn't worth much when you're going to lose it immediately because you have no army. So just keep that in mind. Armies are what do a lot of the fighting for you in a late game. Towers are there to support you, and you should be using towers to push with your army, but you can't make towers if you don't have sufficient army coverage. You can even see that as early as, like, the 8 militia period. Some players will opt to place a tower. A good example is Hidden Valley in the middle of the map. If you manage to fight and win the middle of the map with your first 8 militia before you make your first house, some players will just opt to take a farm and make a tower in the middle to basically claim that. That tower never goes up without militia support, and it doesn't stay up without militia support. Unless you have like a million towers and your opponent just, for whatever reason, hates artillery. Right, all of this has to work together. Your militia are way better at fighting when they're in range of a friendly tower, and your tower will actually stay on the map when there's friendly militia nearby. Ditto for the late game, except even more so. If there's enemy heavy tanks nearby, you need your own heavy tanks to hold your towers. Should you have heavy tanks and towers in a particular location, you are much more favored to win a fight, even if you're down 2 tanks, 3 tanks maybe, so, provided you have decent enough healing. Of course, you might start becoming susceptible to enemy artillery fire if you're playing too close to your towers, but just to be aware. The importance of towers is not that they're going to hold ground on their own, but that they help you hold ground in the face of an enemy, and they help you push the enemy back to their own friendly towers. Right? They sort of solidify a battle line, where it then becomes harder to push forward. Not impossible if there are no enemy units opposing you or them. But it makes it harder for the opponent to push forward and more costly to push forward. And so your army can do a better job of holding its ground, which then allows you to creep forward with more towers, since you're supported by not only your army, but also towers, etc., etc. Eventually, you and your opponent's towers should meet in an ideal endgame. They should meet where the towers are exactly opposing the enemy's towers, where there is no range whatsoever between yours and theirs, but that there's enough space between your towers so that they aren't getting shelled at the same time by the same artillery. Okay, so I have yammered on here for about, I don't know how much it's going to be after I cut out some of the blank space for your viewing pleasure, but at least on my end it's 44 minutes, and I've had a decently fine time with this. I guess I'll end this off by stating, in the endgame, if you're playing anything other than a 1v1, provided that you and your allies are fighting an opponent and their allies that all have armies, maxed armies, the winner of a competition between two teams of players is going to be the one with more coordination, better coordination. Strictly speaking, if you can concentrate your force on an enemy at the right time in the right place, I mean, there's not much you can do as a single player to fight 330 supply of army. You really can't do anything. Especially if you have multiple players building towers and static defense on multiple fronts, pushing you back to your base. Sure, at that point you rely on your allies to start helping you out, but if you're not well coordinated, your allies might not see that you are in danger and go, oh yes, I need to pressure the opponent. They might go, oh snap, I need to come to whoever's rescue, and then... Anyways, discipline is going to be a part of that, but coordination in general. If you have a decent feeling that your team can work together to accomplish their goals in a very satisfactory manner, that's usually enough to overcome an opponent who doesn't have that. In any case, I'll stop yammering on now. I do need to get this uploaded. I apologize that this video is going to be a day or two late, but at the same time, I don't owe you anything. But thank you anyways for watching till the end. I really do appreciate it. If you skipped a couple minutes of this, I really don't know what's wrong with you, but I also don't blame you. I don't know what's wrong with me either, if that makes you feel any better. As always, I hope that you have a wonderful day. And remember to stay classy. I'll see you next week at some time with the next episode of The Joy of NRTS.